Hey BookTube, it's Samantha, and if you remember, a little while ago, I recorded a video about short books that I wanted to read. I'll link that up above if you want to watch that, but the video kind of got me thinking maybe I should also do a video about my favorite books that I have read that are short. So that is what this video is for today. Now, I want to go in letting you guys know how I picked these books and how I'm going to talk about them. These books are based off of my 5-star reads on Goodreads since I've started, which was probably like 2012, 2013. So these are going to be books that I've probably talked about recently, but there are also going to be a lot of books on here that I have not talked about since my channel is really new still. Because it's covering about, 6 years of reading, there are a lot of books on this. I'm a little surprised because I normally don't go to short books, but then on the other hand, I do turn to short books when I'm in a reading slump, so maybe it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. There are approximately 23 to 25 books on this list, so I wanted to let you know that ahead of time because I know this is probably a longish video. Now, what I'm going to be doing is talking about these books in their genres, or how I classify them in genres, and I will leave timestamps below if you're only interested in particular genres. Hopefully you'll want to watch to see, to kind of branch out a little bit. I think novellas are a really good way to explore into different genres, especially if you've never tried that genre before, or maybe you had a bad experience in the past. You can try a short book. You have maybe an hour or two of dedication to go into that book, and if you just really don't care for it, either it's the book, the author, or maybe it's just the genre. You can't go wrong with reading a novella. You really can't. Now, within these genres, I'm not going to put them in any order because honestly, there's so many books that if I were to put them within genres and then within order of how I recommend them, it's just too much. I love doing that, but it's too much. I also want to preface this by saying all of these books on this list are 250 pages or less. So that is what I consider a short book. And all of these, except maybe one, are individual stories. There's one that's 80 pages long, so I think in most bind-ups there are other stories by that author. But for the most part, all of these are a novella. So let's get going. The first genre that I'm going to talk about are classics. These are the books that probably most of you have already heard, and so I'm not going to go into depth about these books, maybe a sentence or two about what they're about and why I really enjoyed it. First one I'm going to talk about is Night by Elie Wiesel. This is really small. It's just over 100 pages, but man, there is so much emotion packed into this book. If you haven't heard of this book, it's actually a trilogy, but I prefer to read it as a standalone. It's about the author's experience of going through the Holocaust. He was in Auschwitz, and then he was transferred to Buchenwald. So it just talks about his experience through the Holocaust, and it's as heartbreaking as you think it is. When I was in middle school, I was really obsessed with the Holocaust. I don't know why, I can't tell you why, but this is one of the books that I read, and every once in a while I read this book. I don't know, especially in times where I feel kind of numb. Might be really weird, but when I feel numb, I'll pick up this book because I know I'm going to feel some emotion out of it. It kind of helps break my shell, if that makes sense. Next book is Fahrenheit 451 by Bradbury. By Ray Bradbury. I didn't think I'd get tongue-tied on this, but apparently I did. I still haven't taken the sticker off. This is from my book haul that I recently did. This is basically about a world where reading is illegal. Prohibited, but flat out illegal. They burn books, everything. hence the matches. It's just a really interesting, fascinating read. This book looks thick, but it's just because of this edition. The actual story is this much of it. According to here, the page number says 158, so it fits. Highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Next book is The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. This book I remember reading in high school. Definitely would read it again. It's basically about this guy who is a hunter, and this random stranger kind of washes up on shore, and he goes to try and get help from this guy, but instead of getting help, he becomes the hunted. So it's just a really fascinating tale. I really like the adventure and the thrill that you're getting out of it. Your heart's racing right along with him, the guy who's being hunted. Just a really great story, and it's really short. So there's no reason to really not read it. It's pretty easily accessible for a classic. Kind of on a closely related note, the next book I'm talking about is The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. This is a book that I randomly decided to pick up just for the heck of it, and I'm so glad I did. This book is about a guy who is shipwrecked, kind of like the previous one, and he's on this island and meets this doctor who is doing some experiments on the island. As the guy is exploring the island, trying to find a way off the island, he runs into one of the doctor's experiments, and it's not exactly what he thought it was. This book is really fascinating for me to read because it really makes you think about a lot of different philosophical points. One of the main ones being, where does the line go with science on whether it is a benefit to scientific discovery or being humane? You know, like it's like towing that line of what is exactly considered humane, especially when you think about testing on animals with hygiene products or anything with chemicals in it, you know, like kind of along those similar lines. Where's the line on that, as well as other topics? It was really easily accessible. Again, for it being a classic, I really enjoyed it. I think I read it in 1 or 2 sittings. It's very short. Highly recommend it. Next book is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I recently read this book. I'm not going to go much into it. It is a fictionalized telling of this man named Siddhartha who is trying to just find his purpose in life. It was just a really interesting read. Again, another philosophical one about what is the purpose of life? What are we actually meant to do here on Earth with the time that we're given? And I really enjoyed reading this book. I really gained a lot out of it, and I really loved how the main character was flawed. It seemed like at the beginning he's like perfect and all-knowing, but as you read on in the book, you realize, no, he messes up too, just like all the rest of us, and what do we do with that? The next book on my list is that one that's kind of an exception, and that is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This one is a short story and is not necessarily a standalone, but I absolutely love the development of this story. I really don't want to give too much away about it because it is so short, a lot shorter than these other books, but it is about this woman and her husband that are temporarily renting this house for 3 months while their other home's being fixed, but he also uses the excuse that it is until she feels better, whatever that may be. And the room that she is staying in has this horrible yellow wallpaper. That doesn't seem very interesting, I know, but this story is so creepy and has that psychological twist to it that is just so perfect. So I highly recommend giving it a shot. It's probably like a 15-minute, 30-minute read. So definitely recommend it. It is so good. Another classic that I have read, and it's been a while, I'm not gonna lie, is Things Fall Apart by Chinwe Achebe. I've actually read this book twice. I read it once in high school, and then I read it once in college. And I think it was good that I read it in college. I think high school was a little too early for me to read it. This is about a family in Africa. They show you how they live their life, and then about halfway through, it starts going through the colonization process and what that does to their family and their identity. In high school, I remember reading it, but kind of being annoyed by it. I don't think I was mature enough to understand the content of what I was reading. Like, obviously, if you've read the end, like, obviously I was feeling some stuff for the ending, but I wasn't mature enough to read it. So when I read it in college, I got a lot more out of it. So with this book, I would recommend reading it college or older. I wouldn't say it's necessarily for high school students. I mean, you could read it as a high schooler, but I don't think you'll really understand the purpose of it until you're more mature, if that makes sense. I also want to talk about The Giver by Lois Lowry. This book, I'm pretty sure everyone's read. I actually read this really late in life. I didn't read it until like probably a few years ago, to be honest. It was never a required reading for me, so I picked it up on my own. I know this is part of a series, but I have actively chosen to not continue the series. I was happy with the first book as it was, as a standalone. I really love this book. I love how it ended. I know a lot of people don't like how it ends, but I love it. I love it. I think it was appropriate to the plot of the book. And if you haven't read it, I give it a shot. And the last book in my classics genre is The Great Gatsby by Scott F. Fitzgerald. This is a classic, and I know this one has mixed reviews, but for me, I love this book. I honestly cannot tell you why I love this book, because I read it and I can see why people wouldn't be interested in it. It kind of seems a little, not necessarily boring, but it seems like almost like lacks substance, but I think it's because some of the characters in the story are very superficial and lack substance. So I just really identify with Gatsby trying to do his all for this person that he loves. It's mainly a story set in the 1920s, talking about living the high class life, and that sometimes it's not all it may seem. If you haven't tried it, I would say give it a shot. If you don't like it, I'm not going to be offended. I get it. But for some reason, this book just is always hitting spot on for me. The next genre that I'm going to be talking about is fantasy. Now, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there aren't very many books in this section. Usually fantasy books are a lot bigger, or at least the ones that I like to read. I usually like to go for the thick ones. In this section, the first one I'm going to talk about is The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. This book, I'm pretty sure, is part of the Cosmere. If you don't know what the Cosmere is, Brandon Sanderson's kind of writing this whole universe, and different series are involved in this Cosmere. They're all part of the same universe. So with this one, what I really enjoyed about it was the unique magic system of this. I really loved the main character, and I was right there with her every step of the way. I was engaged from page one, and I just absolutely blew through this. I'm pretty sure I actually read this book in one sitting. If you like unique magic systems, if you want a short read, and you want a fantasy book, this is a great one to go to. It is compact, short and sweet. You don't necessarily have to read any of other Brandon Sanderson books in order to understand this one, because the magic system is different than with other books. Although I am kind of curious, if you do try this book out, or if you have read it and not read any other Brandon Sanderson, can you let me know down below if it actually did make sense for you? I'm kind of curious now, because I've read Brandon Sanderson, so for me, reading this book made sense, but maybe as a brand new book it wouldn't. I'm not sure, so let me know down below. But I really love this book and definitely want to get it on my shelves at some point. The next two books I've already talked about multiple times. I'm not going to talk about them very much, but they are the first two books in the Wayward Children series, Every Heart a Doorway being the first book, and Down Among the Sticks and Bones being the second book by Shauna McGuire. Now, with these books, They're definitely my favorite. The first time around, I gave this one 4 stars, but upon reading it a second time, 5 stars. It's basically these kids, kind of like Alice in Wonderland or Wendy from Peter Pan, where they go to these alternate worlds or alternate universes, and for one reason or another, these kids are kicked out and put back in the real world, and they're trying to deal with that. So I really love these books. I really love this one, probably more than this one. The third book, which is Beyond the Sugar Sky, I gave 4 stars. I didn't love it as much as I loved this one. And I haven't read the 4th book yet, so I can't give my opinion on that, but definitely love these. The next books I'm going to talk about are middle grade / young adult. Now, I know I could get a little more specific than that, but I think this is just the best way to group these books together, and you'll see why. So let's get into it. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Maze of Bones by Rick Riordan. I know he's obviously really famous for the Percy Jackson series and the series related to that one. This is one of those undiscovered gems that I don't think got enough recognition. I read this book, oddly enough, when I was at Boys Town. We have some books for the kids to read if they ever felt like reading. And this was one of the books on the shelves, and I wanted to give it a shot. Dude, I freaking loved it. It was amazing. From what I remember, from the perspective of this kid, he's like 11, 12-ish. I believe there's been a death in the family, and the whole family comes in. There's some sort of treasure involved, and the whole family is trying to find the treasure first. There's a lot of little clues along the way as they're trying to find this, and what I really love about it is that even in the writing of the physical book, there are little clues to help you along and try to figure out things as you go. I believe there's 39 books in the series, because I think that's the name of the series. I've only read the first one, but I'm like super curious about the rest of the books. Are there rest of the books? I don't even know if he's finished it. I only know about the first one, but I really loved it. I really love the idea behind it. I'm definitely one of those puzzle people, so I just love this one. Next book I'm going to talk about is Dead Poets Society by N.H. Kleinbaum. Now, you're probably wondering why I put this book in middle grade young adult instead of classics, but I think that that's the age that this book should be read, is for middle grade to young adults, because it's a coming of age story. Another book that I read later on in life afterwards, I wish I had read it when I was a teenager or in middle school. I think it's just a really great experience of these boys coming together on something that is their own little thing. You know, they're making their own group and their relationships, and life from outside is trying to break that apart. It's a great coming of age story, and I believe it belongs in this genre. The next one that is also similar to the previous book is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. Another one that I read later on in life. I realized a lot of people, they had this as a recommended read in school, and I decided to pick this book up on my own and absolutely loved it. Again, another coming of age story. Is this group of kids, and they get torn apart by their surroundings in their life. I know they sound really similar, but both of these books are very much different. I understand that I'm not really giving them true justice on it, but I really enjoyed both of these stories. Definitely hit a punch for me, and highly recommend for that middle grade, maybe more high school age. The next book is Small Spaces by Catherine Arden. I actually heard about this book from Tea Hags, and I'll leave a link to their channel down below. This was one of the books that was mentioned on their channel, and I thought it sounded really interesting and wanted to give it a shot. I'm definitely glad that I did. I think this is like middle grade, maybe like early high school age book. I didn't think it was gonna creep me out because it's middle grade / high school, you know, like young adult. But dude, this book creeped me out. I absolutely loved it. If you're looking for something creepy, this is the book. I absolutely loved it. Another book I think I read in like 1 or 2 sittings, like legit. I just absolutely flew through it. Next book is Briar Rose by Jane Yolen. I feel like I've talked about this book on my channel before. I have read this like at least 4 times now. It is kind of like a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, but during the Holocaust. Again, that Holocaust theme, but I'm just a freaking sucker for it. I read this in middle school, again, when I was obsessed with the Holocaust, and I just reread it every once in a while. I love this story. I really don't want to give much more than that because that's really all you need. The next book is Matilda by Roald Dahl. This is a beloved classic. I watched the movie about 100 times when I was a kid because, you know, I identified with Matilda, and I wish that I had telekinetic powers like she did. That would have been awesome. But I read the book again later on in life and just loved how accurate the movie was to the book. Sometimes the movie elaborated a little bit more on certain ideas, but I love how closely related they are. That's always a big plus in my book, and so glad I read the book. Next book that is very similar to the other one is Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim by Robert C. O'Brien. This is a book that I watched the movie before, but I also knew what the plot was. Like, it was kind of already spoiled for me before I even watched the movie, and then I read the book afterwards, so I knew what was going to happen, but I really loved how the book was written. I felt like the big twist of the book was perfectly done, and it's so easy to read. Again, it was a really light read. I think I read it in like an hour and a half. You know, it was just amazing. I love the creativity that goes into it. And this is appropriate for really, well, not any age, but like middle grade and up for sure. I enjoyed it even as an adult. And the last book for this category of middle grade to young adult is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. This is one of the very few Neil Gaiman books I actually enjoy. I kind of have a 50-50 love-hate relationship with his books. With this one, it's about this girl who moves into a new house, and she discovers a tiny little door. Magically, it takes her into a completely other world that seems ideal, but looks can be deceiving. I loved the creepy atmosphere of this book. I think I would have been creeped out even more if I did not know what happened in the book, but I watched the movie multiple times. I love Tim Burton. I'm sure that as my Goosebumps loving self in middle school and high school, I would have loved this book as well. I just wish I had found it sooner. So this next section is going to be kind of like a miscellaneous everything else kind of category, because I usually, I only have like 1 or 2 books that would fit a genre, and there's not that many of them, so I'm just gonna clump them all together. Okay. First one I'm gonna talk about is We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Adichie. I loved this. It is actually an essay that she had written that was published. I'm pretty sure she even did a TED Talk on this. I don't know if it might be even a full transcript of her TED Talk now that I'm thinking about it. But I absolutely loved reading this. I highly recommend this because feminist has such a negative connotation nowadays, and certain people take it to an extreme, and that's not where it should be. And so Chimamanda puts feminism into perspective, and she also shows the differences between living in, I believe she's from Nigeria, and the US. So that's just a really interesting take on it, and I really appreciated that perspective. So highly recommend this. Literally 30 minutes, 45 minutes, you can take 45 minutes to read this, okay? Okay. The next one is called The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. I really love this book, but I do have to say you need to make sure you time it well if you're an emotional reader. Don't read this when your life is falling apart, because you're just gonna be a complete mess. This book is written by a guy who has a terminal illness. He is going to die, and it's going to be sooner rather than later. And he gives this last lecture as kind of a lessons learned in my life that he wants to share on to others. It was just such a great read. Even though he's dying, he doesn't have this negative woe is me vibe to it. It's more of like, let me share the good stuff with others and the things that I wish I spent more time on so that others can benefit from it. And I just love that about the book. It's very short, very sweet, but expect yourself to be crying throughout the whole book because it just is heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching, but I don't regret reading it whatsoever. Next book on my list is not necessarily the book itself, but kind of recommending the series, and that's the Cat Who series by Lillian Jackson Braun. This is the book that I particularly have, which is The Cat Who Talked to Ghosts. I believe the first one is The Cat Who Can something backwards. Write backwards, talk backwards, walk backwards. Something about backwards. But anyway, these books are all super short. It's definitely in the mystery genre. It is about this guy who has this, oddly enough, very smart cat who helps him solve murders or just mysteries in themselves. And I love the lightheartedness that this series has. It's very quirky, but it still has that mystery feel. It's not necessarily going to be like all those surprising, like, oh my god, I didn't see that coming. But I mean, it's a lighthearted read. It's small. If you're looking for a mystery, like, you can't go wrong with this. It's just perfect. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn. This book I had not heard about from anyone else. I honestly don't even know how I heard about the book. This is about a woman who works in one of those shady places that gives hand jobs and also psychic readings. She was in the back room doing the hand jobs, and then she gets moved up front and is now a psychic. Well, this woman named Susan comes into the place and says that her life is kind of falling apart. She's having some issues with the house, possibly haunted, and there are a lot of issues with her stepson named Miles. This is so good. I know at the very beginning it's a little uncomfortable because she's talking about her job as a person giving hand jobs to people. But once you get past that section and it starts talking about Susan, like, it's a good read. But you kind of have to read the beginning in order to appreciate the whole book. So good. It messes with your mind and you're trying to figure out what is actually going on. Absolutely loved it. If you love something that's going to mess with your head, this is the book to read. Definitely can be read in one sitting. I absolutely loved it. And the last book on my list is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Like, oh my god, I love this edition. Anyway, I read this book, I want to say last year, and really loved it. One of my things that I love about horror books is a haunted house. Like, that's always been my thing. I love haunted house books. And I thought that's what I was going to be getting here. But interestingly enough, this is more of a psychological horror than it is a haunted house. Once I realized that, I still really love the book. It's a slow burner throughout. Like, it's short. It looks long here, but it's short. I think it's like 200 some pages, 235, but it slowly gets you into it. And that's what's always best about psychological thrillers, is when they slowly do it. And then at the point that you get to the end, it's like, oh my god, like, how did we get here? But then you look back and you're like, oh god, they did such a good job of building up to this point that it's just, oh. So I know this isn't all of the books that I talked about, but those are the books that I really love. They're all 5-star reads for me, all under 250 pages that I would recommend for you to try. I will leave links down below of all the books because I understand you can't see them here. So I want to make sure that you don't have to go through the whole video, or maybe you can get a better description off of Goodreads, which is what I'll leave down below. But let me know if you've read any of these books or if any of them sound interesting to you. I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts are, or if there's a book that I should read that is under 250 pages. Please let me know down below. Otherwise,